Thoracic vertebrae. Thoracic vertebrae starts from T1 to T12, are considerably larger and stronger than cervical vertebrae, and become progressively larger from superior to inferior. Vertebral body of the upper thoracic bodies are triangular in their superior outline, while the lower thoracic vertebral bodies are more circular. The most distinguishing feature of the thoracic vertebrae is that they have articular facets on their lateral side for articulation with head of ribs. We'll get to know them as we'll find them elsewhere from the images illustrating them. Each typical rib has two articulations with vertebrae, one on adjacent thoracic bodies and one on the end of other thoracic transverse process. So these are the articulation of ribs onto the thoracic vertebrae, and these are them. So we have the thoracic vertebrae T1, T2 to T8. They have these specific unique features: T9, T10, T11, and T12. So they dominate this level of the level of vertebral column. I was about to say the intervertebral disc because that's what we've been learning from. So the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae of T1, we have the superior vertebral notch at this level. Then we have superior facet of the rib, of the head of rib, where the head of rib comes into contact with this first thoracic vertebrae. Then we have inferior vertebral notch, then inferior demifacet for head of rib. It's marked by this level. Then the pedicle is literally there. Then superior demifacet for head of rib from T2 to T8. Then the inferior demifacet for head of rib. It's located down there. We have superior articular facet. As you can see, projects superiorly. Then facet for articulation, facet for articular part of tubercle of rib, located at this level. Then superior demifacet for head of rib, and that is vertebral body. And then we have superior facet for head of rib at T10. Then T11 only have this part whereby the head of rib comes into contact with it. Intervertebral foramen, it's located at this level. And all through, remember, this are illustration from lateral view of thoracic vertebrae. Okay, fine, we have a much detailed explanation of these levels of different vertebrae, and I think I should take you through them because that's my work. So we have the first atlas, then axis, then we have the typical cervical vertebrae, then thoracic, then we have the lumbar vertebrae, finally sacrum, while coccyx dominates the most distal part of the vertebral column. So it said this is the odontoid process from our previous discussion. Vertebral foramen are these points, and we have the vertebral body. And from this, most of our major concern, we have thoracic vertebrae, spinous process from the back. We have the bodies that right there, the head of rib, it's this part, and we told body of vertebrae and the head of rib articulating each other to costovertebral joint, which is at this location. Then the part labeled 20 is the transverse process and tubercle of rib articulating with each other at costotransverse joint. Yeah. So for the rest, hold on a little bit because we'll get to learn about them. This is the case of typical thoracic vertebrae, and the ribs added for the same case. And we have this part labeled 23 is the superior facet for articulation with the head of rib. And we have at the part labeled 21 is the facet for articulation with the rib. This majorly can say the tubercle of the rib, because for the head comes into contact with this part, then tubercle definitely that level. Then we have this point 25 is the inferior facet for articulation with head of rib. Yeah, it's the inferior demifacet of this first thoraces, then the second demifacet is the superior, which is this point. The rest are the ribs, of which we'll find them elsewhere as we get along. This is the typical thoracic vertebrae, and you can see parts labeled by blue are the facets for articulation with ribs. As for this case, 14 is the articular facet with the head. Then we have a point labeled by 15 is the transverse process, but this is the facet articulation is as well the tubercle of the rib, and then part labeled 9 is the superior articular facet with the adjacent superior thoracic vertebrae, and 8 is the body of the vertebrae. These are the thoracic vertebrae without the ribs, and you can see T1 moving to T2 with T3 right here, T4, T5, and T6. These are the typical thoracic vertebrae. T7, T8, T9, T10, T11, then finally T12. You can note that the vertebral bodies are increasingly changing in size. You can see as they progress down to the level of another vertebrae, their size becomes much larger. Okay, well, let's get to the description part. Demifacets are formed when the head of a rib articulates with two adjacent vertebral bodies. On each side of the vertebral body, T1 has a superior facet for the first rib and an inferior demifacet for the second rib. On each side of the vertebral body of T2 to T8, there is a superior demifacet and an inferior demifacet, as rib 2 through 9 articulate with two vertebrae each. T9 has superior demifacet on each side of the vertebral body, and T10 to T12 have a facet on each side of the vertebral body for ribs 10 to 12. In addition, the spinous processes are long, straight, and narrow. T1 through T10 also, T1 through T10 are long, laterally flattened, and directed inferiorly. In contrast, the spinous processes of T11 and T12 are shorter, broader, and directed more posteriorly. So for the demifacets, you're told from different levels of these thoracic vertebrae, they present in the unique form as we're told. For the T1, we have the superior facet of the head of rib, then inferior demifacet. Then moving down to the level of T2 to T8, we have superior demifacet now and inferior demifacet. Remember, from the first, we only have superior facet, then inferior demifacet. But from the level of T2 to T8, we have superior demifacet and an inferior demifacet. Then down to level of T9, we have superior demifacet of head of rib, T10 superior demifacet of head of rib, then T11 to T12 we only have the points of which have the facets for the rib. For the T9, we as well have from their transverse process, we have facet for articular part of tubercle of rib, and as well for the T10. But T11 does not have those structures. Compared to cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae also have longer and larger transverse processes. They are easily identified by costal facets or fovea on the anterolateral corner that forms synovial articulation with tubercle of the ribs, only for the exception of T11 and T12. Yeah, you can understand this from T11, T12, they lack costal or transverse facet for articulation with the rib. We only have these transverse processes, but from the others, we have those facets. This articulation between the thoracic vertebrae and ribs called vertebrocostal joint, which are distinguishing features of thoracic vertebrae. So those, I've already explained that. Movements of the thoracic region are limited by thin intervertebral disc and by the attachment of the ribs to the sternum. So that's all about that. Then we also have general organization of ribs and vertebrae. This is a schematic drawing. spinous process projects posteriorly at this level. We have the vertebral foramen and the vertebral body, which is right here. Then the part labeled 18 of this case, we have body of vertebra and head of rib here articulating with each other at this level. 37 is the pedicle, 20 is the transverse process and tubercle of rib articulating with each other at costotransverse joint. Remember, we have costovertebral joint at this level, then costotransverse joints at this level. For this case, is the head and the vertebral body of the vertebrae of thoracic, then transverse process of thoracic vertebra with the tubercle of the rib. The superior and inferior articular process form flat articular surface positioned in the frontal plane. The surface of the superior articular facet faces posteriorly, and the surface of the inferior articular facet faces anteriorly. The anterior and posterior facing surfaces contact each other and limit forward and backward bending of this region of the vertebral column, while allowing small amounts of rotational movement and significant lateral bending. Yeah, so being able to identify this image and we have discussed in advance, so just move down. Only for the case of the superior articular facet, which we've been told faces more superiorly than for the other case, inferior articular facet. Okay, this faces posteriorly and the other one faces anteriorly. You can note from this T9, inferior then superior. Unique features of specific thoracic vertebrae. The first thoracic vertebrae has a costal facet superiorly and half costal facet inferiorly. It retains more cervical-like characteristic of its spine and body than any other thoracic vertebrae. Then the 10th thoracic vertebrae usually has a complete superiorly placed costal facet on each side of the vertebral body and costal articulation on the transverse process. 11th thoracic vertebrae has an intact superiorly placed costal facet on each side of the vertebral body, but no costal articulation on transverse process. The 12th thoracic vertebrae resembles T11, but the inferior articular facet assumes the lumbar pattern.